Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson, and this is Keep It Real. Keep It Real is all about real talk based on my 20 plus years of clinical experience. What we're really talking about is real food, real medicine, and real change. Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Today I'm going to answer a question from one of my participants in the program, the Metabolic Magic Method. I've already answered the question for them in a live Q&A Zoom discussion, but I thought it was a pertinent question and one that maybe other people might find interesting to hear the answer to. So the question is basically what to do about really significant nighttime cravings. We might call them stress cravings, we might call them habitual cravings or a sweet craving, or there's lots of different ways that I think we could describe it, but it's a common problem. And before I discovered that I had metabolic syndrome, and before I figured out how to reverse my metabolic syndrome, I absolutely knew what this feeling is. It's, for me at least, it was after dinner, maybe an hour or two after dinner, I would get a craving for something kind of sweet. And this could be maybe even something that I was regarding as healthy, like maybe a bowl of berries with some nuts and maybe a little bit of honey on it, something like that. But of course, it can be a cookie or it can be ice cream or one of these kind of things. So a participant asked, what can we do in this situation? They're eager to follow the dietary program, but these cravings can be just insatiable. And I absolutely empathize with that. Before I got off of the metabolic spectrum, I absolutely remember like it was yesterday, sitting on the couch and without recognizing that time had passed, I was standing in my pantry eating tortilla chips. And I'm like, what? How did I don't remember walking over here. So I absolutely know that feeling. There's a bit of a skill that it's a way to decrease the craving. And the craving itself is one thing, but the way I explain the answer to this participant is we get a thought. And before that thought turns into an action or the next step, we typically assign very quickly an emotion to it. And then once we assign an emotion, there's kind of a whole release of certain neurotransmitters and hormones, and it's very difficult to fight through those to have agency over that thought and that subsequent action. But there's a little tiny window of space in between the thought and assigning an emotion and taking action. If we could put a little wedge between those two, between the thought and assigning an emotion, we can open up that space and we could take a little bit more agency over the next steps. And so how do we do that? What kind of wedge would open up that space in there? There's a couple different things. One of them could be you recognize that the desire for whatever that food popped in your head. And so you can just sit and take a deep breath. Maybe you sit there and take 5 nice, slow, deep breaths in and out. What you've just done is you just open up that window where you can now start to have more agency over the next steps. Another thing you can do is you can have a glass of water. You'd be surprised that sometimes our thirst and hunger signals can get a little crossed, or maybe just the water itself helps to satiate you enough that you can buy yourself a little bit more time for maybe another distraction. Maybe you go for a walk. Maybe you grab a book. Maybe you make some tea, something like that. It's just about grabbing control of that little window of space before you assign an emotion to it, and you wedge that gap open. And that allows you to have a little bit more agency over your next steps. And guess what? This is a skill. This is something that I remember the first time I did this, and I had strong cravings, and I really wanted to go have maybe some tortilla chips or something in the pantry. And I wanted to try to overcome this. And I definitely failed at the beginning more than succeeded. But once I started to implement this idea of expanding that space in between the thought and the action, I started to, the first time it did it, I actually felt super successful. I was a little mentally uncomfortable going to bed thinking that I'm hungry or that I had this strong craving. But I put that wedge, opened up that space, and I went to bed, woke up the next day. I'm like, wow, I survived. I was actually okay. And that was actually kind of a big deal because then I thought if I could do that once, I can keep applying that skill over and over again and really prevent, this late time eating, which by the way was a big cause of the way that I developed metabolic syndrome was this later eating. And the foods I was choosing weren't necessarily bad foods. It wasn't always tortilla chips. It might have just been some berries or something, but it was just I was getting in, a carbohydrate calorie at the wrong time of day for my digestive system and for my metabolic system. So for me, it was just kind of throwing things haywire. So I thought this was a good question by this participant. And so this is a skill. This is something that you can develop over time. But the thing is, you just want to be as consistent as you can. Let me give one more aside. It's a little bit of a different scenario, but there's another skill that I've learned to develop over time. And this one is if you're over to somebody's house or maybe even at your own house and there's maybe a dish that has, or a little jar that has some candy in it. And maybe it's one that happens sometimes in our house is during the holidays, my wife might put out different candies. And this is for maybe the kids or people coming over. And kind of with the different seasons, the candies kind of change a little bit in the different holidays. And a lot of what the brain has to do with all the things that the brain has to do, it's filtering information out all the time. So it became difficult for my brain to keep filtering out probably how good those candies would taste. And I would, what's wrong with just having one, but I really didn't want to do it. And so I had to completely reframe what that candy dish was. I considered it a decoration as opposed to food. And I don't eat decorations. So when I reframed that, my brain didn't have to keep wondering what was going on and didn't have to keep denying, having some bit of that candy. I just completely reframed it altogether so that when my brain saw it, it just went decoration, like it was a lamp or a candle or something like that. And it just didn't go down the pathway of, oh, this is food. And I'm trying to deny, I'm trying to not eat sugar right now. So I'm trying to deny that whole thing. So again, this is a bit of a skill. It's just kind of it's just a way to reframe something that was a craving before that my brain had to keep working on to try to filter out. So by renaming it and reframing it, it made it much, much easier. And this is something that I've been able to develop now over time. And it has gotten much, much easier to where now this could happen in seconds, whereas before it might have took, several minutes for me to kind of really work through this mentally. So hopefully those are a little tips for you because it's real. These cravings are real, especially if you're coming off a more, higher processed food situation and switching to a more, kind of low carb, low processed food. These cravings will happen. And so hopefully that is a little bit of skill to help you deal with that. So I will keep bringing you the information. Until next time, keep it real.